Good evening and welcome. We are delighted to have you here this evening for the launch of Professor David Lindenmayer's newest book, The Forest Wars. Professor David Lindenmayer has been a friend of Lotta Footprints for many years, and we value his continued contribution to our knowledge about forests and the need to protect them.
Welcome to everyone here tonight. The swift booking out of tonight's event with barely any promotion speaks volumes about the esteem in which our speakers are held. Dr. Monique Ryan is the federal member for Kooyong and a passionate advocate for climate action. Her dedication to environmental issues has been unyielding over the past 2 years. And Monique has been a vocal opponent of native forest logging both in Victoria and nationwide. Monique has many achievements and accolades in her career as a doctor and political life, but she tells me none make her quite so proud as being named the Australian Conservation Foundation's Champion of the Greater Glider. Joining Dr. Ryan is Professor David Lindenmayer. As you know, a world expert in forest ecology whose extensive research has spanned decades. With over 1,400 scientific articles and now 49 books, Professor Lindenmayer's profound impact on forest conservation is unrivalled. He's been studying Australian forests for over 40 years and has helped shape our understanding of how forests are changing and how to best protect them for future generations. David's new book, The Forest Wars, tackles the critical issues facing our native forests. He lifts the lid on destruction of native forests by government corporations and the logging industry that is making bushfires worse, killing wildlife and costing taxpayers millions for the sake of wood chips for export. In the words of Tim Winton, in the face of all the lies and industry spin, this is an evidence-based account that's clear, humane and trustworthy. Tonight's conversation between Dr. Ryan and Professor Lindenmayer is not just a testament to their individual accomplishments, but to the urgent and shared interest in these matters that has brought us together.
David, that's a lot of books.
It is a lot of books. I feel like it's important to contribute to this amazing country. And one of the key things that I thought was important was to paint a different vision, a vision about better management of forests, people working on country, people restoring forests, dealing with the problems that we have to deal with, be it feral animals, failed regeneration, but also putting tourism infrastructure in place to connect people to forests again as part of dealing with the problem of nature deficit disorder, which is rife through our society. So I thought it was critical to be able to tell people at the end, after having debunked a series of myths, that there actually is a better pathway that gives people meaningful work to really take our forests to a different space and really, in a sense, have a great national park, a great set of national parks for a great city.
I personally would really encourage everyone to read the book because I think it is actually a very concise and clear exposition of the issues with our native forests. It debunks many myths, as you said, and lays out very clearly the case for an immediate end to native forest logging in Australia, but also addresses some of the questions about restoration of the land, which we'll come to in a little while. But maybe I could just ask you just to summarise why it is that we need to stop native forest logging in Victoria in particular, but in Australia in general.
There are several reasons why we need to stop logging. The first one is that logging generates very large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. Up until the time that we supposedly stopped native forest logging in Victoria, it was costing us the equivalent of about 730,000 motor vehicles worth of emissions every year. In Tasmania, it's more than 1 million motor vehicle emissions every year. This is an enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we were to stop native forest logging in Australia in the next few months, next year or so, we would actually meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets, full stop. And we would have some left over to meet some of our offsets from other sectors like the transport sector. So that's a critical thing to understand, being able to get to that greenhouse gas emissions target reduction through stopping that source of emissions. The second thing that's important is that when we log native forests, when we thin native forests, we actually make them more flammable. And we make them more flammable for between 40 to 70 years. So that's an extra fire burden that we're dealing with on top of the risks associated with climate change. So the key driver of fire is climate. But underlying that, there is also a problem with how we're managing forests. So there's an extra fire burden. And some of these things are very, very painful personally because of the number of colleagues and friends that have died in fires, including particularly the 2009 fires. The third thing is that Australia has a biodiversity crisis, and we know that when we log forests, we remove habitat for those animals. And in some cases, it's for not 10 years, 20 years, but up to 200 years. So we're contributing to the biodiversity crisis by logging forests. The fourth thing that's very important is that it actually costs us a lot of money. So in Victoria, the last 2 years, Vic Forests cost the state $269 million. In Tasmania, the number is $1.5 billion. In New South Wales, it's in the order of $250 million. So the industry is hemorrhaging large amounts of money. Western Australia, Queensland, all of these places, there are significant losses. Native forest logging is bad for climate, it's bad for fire, it's bad for economics, it's bad for biodiversity. And in fact, native forest logging employs very, very few people. So there are better ways to spend that money that gives the taxpayer a much stronger return on investment and allows us to get to our emissions reduction targets very quickly.
Could you maybe also speak to the effect that logging has on the native forests and the time frame of the impacts that we see after commercial logging through a curve?
Logging fundamentally simplifies the structure of a forest. And the same thing happens whether you're clear felling or whether you're doing repeated and successive selective harvesting. Thinning also simplifies forests. So we tend to lose the biggest trees, which are very important in terms of the number of flowers, the amount of seeds that are produced, the amount of carbon that's stored, the ability to develop hollows. So those effects, losing those big trees, will last at least 200 and maybe longer years into the future. The effect on the soils, we've quantified the impacts on soils for at least 80 years in terms of changes in soil carbon, soil structure, all those kinds of things. In terms of plants, we lose some of the most important wetter elements of forests, particularly tree ferns. So forests that have had a history of logging have a 96% reduction in tree ferns, which then affects not only the temperature regime in forests, but also the microclimate. So we know that log forests are hotter and they're more variable in temperature. And those hotter, more variable temperatures are impossible for animals like greater gliders to survive. The greater glider is very heat sensitive, and when we elevate temperatures, greater gliders do very badly. Greater gliders cannot stand too many successive nights of high overnight temperatures. They can't feed for long enough to be able to survive. Their diet is only eucalypt leaves. The hotter it is, the shorter the time that they can feed, the more quickly they lose body condition and the more quickly they die. So there are these very long-term effects that persist for many, many, many years in the forest. And these are not effects that we just dream up. These are things that we have documented in many studies over many places over many years. The effect on water catchments is profound, and this is something very close to my heart because my father-in-law was one of the few chief engineers that worked for the predecessor to Melbourne Water, the Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works. And so he was responsible for overseeing the construction of the Thomson Dam, and he was connected to a lot of the people that worked on key areas of catchment hydrology. And what happens is that when a forest is logged or it burns and it regenerates, the young trees go very quickly. They use a lot of water. That's drawn out of the soil. That water doesn't flow overland into streams and creeks and then into dams. So if you're a catchment manager, the aim of the game is to grow your catchments as old as possible to produce as much water as possible for as long as possible. So the analysis that we've done for one catchment, that's the Upper Thomson catchment, ongoing logging in that catchment has a bigger effect than climate change under some climate scenarios, to the effect that by 2050, ongoing logging in that catchment would give you the equivalent of Geelong's water supply that was lost to the system. The only way to replace that water is through desal, which is not only very expensive, but it also generates a lot of carbon emissions. So the best thing for the city in terms of securing the water supply for 5 million people is to not log your catchments.
That being the case, and knowing that we're going to need our water for all those small modular reactors that that we'll be benefiting from in the next 30 to 50 years, perhaps you could just cover some of what you've covered in the book in terms of the behaviour of Vic Forests in terms of effect on water catchments, reliability of its logging practices and the extent to which it abides by regulations for those.
Oh gosh, so one of the myths in the book is that, and we hear it regularly, including in Parliament House recently, that Australia has the best regulated forests in the world. They're not my terms, they're somebody else's. The reality is that even as we speak today, there is an area of forest out in eastern Victoria that's on private land that somehow has the logging operation on that private land has spilt over across the boundary into neighbouring state forests, and a special protection zone for leadbeater's possum somehow got caught up in the logging gear. So I think it's really important to understand that there's a history here of breaching logging practices, be it on steep slopes, in logging exclusion zones, in water supply catchments, areas of leadbeater's possum zones, areas of greater glider habitat. There is a long, long history of breaches of regulations. But in one of the chapters, I talk about the myth that Melbourne is not Moscow. And I need to talk about this because I've discovered that I was subject to a prolonged period of surveillance by Vic Forests. It was confirmed by the Office of the Victorian Information Commissioner, and that report has now gone to IBAC. I was not the only person that was subject to that. There were others who received the same kind of surveillance. And frankly, in a modern democracy, that kind of behaviour from an organisation that is supposed to be responsible for managing forests to somehow then take over some of the responsibilities from ASIO, I don't think is appropriate. And I think that goes beyond the pale in terms of what's important here. We are reporting science, we're reporting what our results are, but to be surveilled like that I think is totally inappropriate.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. There is this ongoing debate about the place of salvage logging,
Yep.
which is a really tendentious point. I can tell you in the House, when it comes up, the Nationals get very heated about it and about its importance. They like to get heated. But can you speak to salvage logging and what your feelings about it?
Salvage logging is also what's called post-disturbance logging. And it takes place after not only wind throw events where the trees get blown down, but also extensively, even today, in Victoria after wildfires. The thinking is that you're recovering some of the value of the forest by salvaging the trees that have been damaged. So we wrote the first textbook on salvage logging in 2008. Post-disturbance logging is the most damaging form of logging that you can undertake in a forest. The forest has to experience at least 2 major disturbance events in a row. So you might, for example, have a fire which damaged the system. The forest is then in a process of recovery, but then it's damaged again with a second high intensity disturbance. Many ecosystems can deal with rare high severity impacts. Many ecosystems can deal with very frequent, very low intensity impacts. Almost none can deal with rapid high severity impacts in a row. They are not ecologically geared to deal with those kinds of disturbances. So we have seen that salvage logging is the most damaging form of logging in terms of its impacts on hydrology, in terms of its impacts on soils, its impacts on birds, its impacts on possums and gliders. These are empirical studies that have been done not only in Australia but around the world. It is the most damaging form of logging. But there's another sting in the tail, and that is that when you salvage log a forest, you take out the trees, which are actually not fuel in most fires, but you leave behind the branches, the twigs, the leaves and other things, which is fuel in a fire. And work shows that there's a pulse of flammability immediately after salvage logging. Then when the forest is eventually regenerated, that regenerated forest is also more flammable. So you have two bouts of elevated flammability as a consequence of salvage logging. So for all of those reasons, it's actually the worst way of dealing with a disturbance. The most important way to deal with disturbances is to let the system naturally recover from the normal disturbances that are taking place in forests and not disturb them a second or even a third time.
So what about those forests that don't recover? What do we do? The ones that don't recover spontaneously or naturally?
We know that there are places that have had so much disturbance, either through recurrent fire or through recurrent logging. So one of the big issues with many species of trees is that it takes them time to be able to produce a viable seed crop. And if you have too many disturbances too quickly, the trees haven't recovered. It's got this beautiful name, very sinister name. It's called the interval squeeze problem. If you imagine that, it means that the distance between one disturbance and the next is so short that the trees haven't recovered enough to set seed before they get hit again, so they can't recover. So that's a regeneration failure after fire. But we are also seeing significant regeneration failure after logging. In the Central Highlands, it's up to 18,000 hectares of forest that should have regenerated after logging, which hasn't. Now, we haven't published that work yet, but we're getting close. So in those cases, you do actually need to intervene and you need to replant the forest to get the forest going again. And therein lies opportunities to invest in the forest, to get the forest regenerated, to start recovering habitat, but also fixing carbon and adding to our long-term carbon stocks in the forest. So yes, there's a problem, but there's also an opportunity for restoration in these circumstances.
One of the issues is that it's really important that we discuss the complexities of all of this very respectfully, acknowledging what we know and what we don't know. How do we know how our forests looked like before, what our forests looked like before 1788, and what knowledge do we have about how best to restore them? Okay,
that's a good question. So there's been a lot of popular writing about what Australia's forests looked like in 1788 at the time of British invasion. So Bill Gamage has written a lot about this, saying that there are now more trees in Australia than there were at the time of British invasion. There's a bit of a problem with that. For example, the Strzelecki Ranges is missing most of its trees. The Murray-Darling Basin is missing nearly 15 billion trees. The Big Scrub has got 100 hectares left out of 75,000 hectares. So let's just park that to one side. Bill Gamage looked at photographs, he looked at early diaries, and what he is saying about forests being open and park-like is actually right for grasslands and for woodlands. He's actually right. Bill Gamage is not right when it comes to forests. And we have a paper coming out next week where we've gone in and looked at the diaries of early explorers, if we can call them that. Hume and Hobble walked from near Sydney to near Melbourne. They got to a place called Mount Disappointment. And it's called Mount Disappointment for a reason. They couldn't get close to Mount Disappointment no matter which ways they went. Parvell, Strzelecki, same thing. The diary records actually show people that were unable to walk readily through these incredibly dense wet forests because that's their natural state. So the reality here is that tall wet forests, like the forest on the cover of the book, are actually naturally and inherently tall, dense, wet environments. And as they age, what happens is that we get fewer trees, but we get a wet understory, often of wattles and rainforest trees, and the density of the forest is a function of rainfall. So we've looked at the early photographs, dense wet forest, the early paintings, dense wet forests. We've talked to First Nations elders. They didn't burn those forests. Yes, they went into those forests to collect lyrebird feathers, to collect pith from tree ferns, and for other reasons. But the part of cultural burning in those forests was not something that took place. And so that country is often referred to as no fire country. And that's an important part of management. That's not my words. They're words from Aboriginal elders in these areas. Many of these areas were sacred, no doubt about it. It's recorded in many of the early diaries and other testimonies. But the ecology of these systems is also important. Just a quick digression. When we look at trees like mountain ash forest on the front cover, what we see under the bark are little buds. They're called Epicormic buds. And in many kinds of forests, when the forest burns, the trees become fuzzy trees with new Epicormic shoots that shoot out from the trunk. And you see that in many species of trees. In mountain ash, what happens is that those buds don't work in most cases. And so the interpretation of that is that mountain ash actually evolved from a tree species that did have that capability, but it's lost that capability to resprout. Now, why would you do that? The reason is that it takes a lot of energy to put out resprouts, but in a mountain ash forest, you have to grow very, very quickly to survive, because if you lose the race for light, you die. So you've replaced your ability to resprout with your ability to grow fast. And that tells us that mountain ash forests were places in an evolutionary context where fire was very rare. But that we see it also in other data. The dendrochronology, which is the tree rings, no evidence of regular fire. We see it in the soil profiles. We see it in the carbon dating of tree ferns. Fire was largely rare. And that is important for understanding how we do restoration. Restoration in these forests is about putting the forest back together again in the way that it's supposed to function. These forests do not deal with frequent low-intensity fire. They collapse. And that's why we need to use good science to guide how we do restoration. So the forest will naturally self-thin as time goes on, but as it self-thins, it becomes wetter and less prone to high-severity fire. So this is a natural process of what we call working cooperatively with the ecology to start to limit the progression of fire through the landscape. Now, that's not my term, that's my colleague Phil Zylstra talking about ecological cooperation, but it's a really important part of thinking about long-term flammability. So that's how we put the evidence together about how these forests used to look like, but it's very different to how woodlands, inland woodlands, other areas look like in the past.
So last year, at the end of last year, the federal parliament passed the Nature Repair Markets Bill, which was Tanya Plibersek put this bill in front of the parliament. And essentially what it's about is getting investment from private corporations and other interests to help with environmental restoration and species preservation and restoration as well. And it was a very frustrating bill to speak to because there was very little detail in it. Basically, all of the regulations were missing, and what we were told was just pass it, get it through, and we'll put in the detail later. For people who are nerdly and detail-oriented like the crossbench, it was a frustrating thing to do. But we passed it because we felt we had no option. But one of the many frustrations is the difficulty measuring outcomes. Mm-hmm. And there'll be a bit of talk about this with the EPPC bill when it comes up in front of Parliament at the end of the year, the fact that we worry much of the time that we're greenwashing, that offsets lack integrity, and that the numbers that we record for things like methane emissions and stuff like that are uninterpretable. When we work to restore forests, how do we measure outcomes? How do we put native forests into nature repair? And as we do that, how do we measure the outcomes?
I haven't met anybody yet that can tell me how the nature repair market is going to work. It's not for the want of trying, but we have been working with the business community about bringing in significant investment into these forests and other forests, and it is one of the most exciting opportunities in this space to see significant investment in forests. We are presently building a bond in this space. The cost of the bond for the proposed Great Forest National Park area is less than the cost of remediating one level crossing. And that investment to revegetate areas, we have to control feral deer because they are really suppressing natural regeneration, but therein lies the opportunity for another industry. We need to repair landscapes to provide habitats for animals like greater gliders. But the advantage that we have in the Central Highlands area, if we can ensure that it becomes a Great Forest National Park, is that we can use the 41 years of baseline data to then ensure that we are seeing real progress through the bond. If we make these investments, what did we get? How can we communicate that to taxpayers, to people in the finance sector, to governments? We can use the long-term monitoring that we've done to provide the kinds of information that gives you the transparency that's critical in this space. It gives us the credibility that we're really seeing something real in this space. So this is one of the most exciting opportunities to create a flow of income into this area to actually repair the nature in this space with high quality data that anybody can access and everybody can see what is happening. Now, the monitoring has to be independent of government. It has to be independent of business. It has to be independent of taxpayers. And it has to be able to report that information to anybody that's interested. And it's critical for people to understand that, for example, if we do the monitoring in that space, we do not earn any money from it. It has to be completely credible, unlike what is happening in parts of the carbon market at the moment. So we've seen, for example, in the carbon market, there's a paper we published, I was a co-author, I didn't lead this, just a week or so ago. There is an area the size of Japan in Australia, particularly on the Nullarbor and in rangelands and deserts, which are going to be growing huge, great, big, tall trees as part of the carbon market. That's called greenwashing. And we know that 96% of major restoration programs around the world have been greenwashed. Lamont et al. 2023, published in Science just a few months ago. We can avoid this in this space. We can actually create something that's reputable globally with the background here and create through a Great Forest National Park, which is a great legacy for this amazing city, but also lead the way in the way that these kinds of investments work. We know that there are literally billions of dollars waiting to be invested in this space, but we have to make sure that it's credible investment that gives us proper outcomes that are not greenwashed. So that's our thinking about how we can make the nature repair market work and give people confidence, not just in this room, but in the boardrooms around Australia, that we're actually seeing something real. That's exciting to me. Job opportunities, restoration opportunities, First Nations people working on country, helping address, creating advantage for the most disadvantaged people in the country. To me, that's exciting. We have to tackle the deer problem, because when a forest starts to be regrown after logging or after fire, that's when it's most palatable.
What, the forest or the deer?
Well, they're palatable as well, but the vegetation lacks young plants tend to be more palatable. They lack some of the secondary toxic compounds that limit browsing. And that's one of the reasons why, through so much fire that we've had over large areas, we think that there's been a huge increase in the number of deer right across southeastern Australia, including in Tasmania. So there's an important role for deer control. That needs people working on the ground, people working on country. There's an important role for revegetating areas where we've had regeneration failure. There's an important role for putting nest boxes, hollow hogs, other artificial structures back in the forest because we've simplified the forest a lot. But we also need to put in tourism infrastructure to bring people into the forest to help rejuvenate the economies of some of these parts of rural Australia. So the thinking has been around ensuring we've got two sides to the bond. One side is to do with restoration of forest and management of feral animals and weeds. We've got big weed problems in some areas. Again, needs people on the ground. If we're going to get more vegetation in the forest, that means we need to measure the carbon dividend. We need to measure it. We need people on the ground doing that as well. The other side of the bond is putting in tourism infrastructure to bring people into the forest and build that constituency for conservation, but also provide education opportunities, but also for First Nations people to be able to talk about the wonderful country that they're on and provide that connection, that gelling across our communities. So there's a whole series of things built around regenerating not only forests, but creating opportunities for better jobs, longer lasting jobs, more meaningful jobs, actually caring for country and restoring country, not logging country. One of the fondest memories of my late father was going bird watching with him in the mid-1970s in an area called Mulligan's Flat in the north of Canberra. I was a teenager at the time and I was more interested in football than birds. I was amused by my father and some of his newfound friends who seemed to only have to hear a bird fart from 400 metres to instantly know what it was. I'm quite serious about that. But it was actually a really nice way to spend time with my dad, and it eventually fostered a really deep interest in ornithology that I maintained 45 years later. At Mulligan's Flat, I saw my first brown tree creepers, hooded robins, and many other species. In the late 1970s, my father realised that the woodlands at Mulligan's Flat were special. Mulligan's Flat is the largest remaining patch of yellow box, red box woodland left anywhere in the world. Dad was alarmed at these woodlands, which are formally recognised today as critically endangered, that they were slated for clearing to build tens of thousands of new houses. Dad was passionate about Mulligan's Flat and with his colleagues began advocating for its protection. This, to me, seemed like an impossible task with so much money tied up in housing developments. Yet my father and others kept writing letters, of course doing lots of bird surveys, recruiting lots of other people to get involved, and forever lobbying bureaucrats and politicians. And I can vouch for that because I had to read most of his submissions and do the editing. Dad and his increasing number of friends never gave up, and protecting Mulligan's Flat was just too important for them. Today, Mulligan's Flat is not only a protected reserve, it's surrounded by a predator-proof fence to keep out foxes and cats, and there have been highly successful reintroductions of mammals such as the eastern quoll, the eastern bettong, and a wonderful bird, the bush stone curlew. And in 1975, I actually saw one of the last pairs with my dad. Anyway, Mulligan's Flat's a fantastic place to visit. There's now a visitor centre at Mulligan's Flat and it's teeming with people on weekends, and sometimes it doubles as a conference centre during the week. There's even nighttime tours to see the amazing animals whose populations have recovered in the reserve, but the tours are often fully booked, so it's not easy to get in. And at the visitor centre is a fire pit with a nearby wooden seat that has a plaque bearing his name. And I've sat on that seat many times, looking over Mulligan's Flat, thinking of my dad. His work and that of so many others shows what a group of passionate, persistent and engaged people can achieve in protecting Australia's special environments. These things are important. They are important to ensure the protection so that there is an important legacy for this amazing city of an amazing park. And when you have that tenure change and ensure that it's properly co-managed, then we can truly repair nature and we can really have something special that this city deserves. It's important to understand that Melbourne has added the equivalent of Adelaide's population to the city, but there has been no substantive increase in the amount of reserve country in that time. So now the per capita amount of reserve for a Melburnian is 1/10 of what it is for a Sydney-sider. You're doing 10 times worse than Sydney. You need to know that, because access to parks is so critical for your mental health, your physical health, the well-being of the city itself. And I think it's fundamentally important to understand that difference between Sydney and Melbourne. This city deserves a lot better than that.
Thank you, David. That story from your book is beautiful. It's very moving. I think that you make the point beautifully about the fact that people can have an impact, even small communities can have an impact, but also every conversation can have an impact. Just before we go to questions, could you perhaps talk about Robert Hill? Because I thought that your mentions of him in the book were really interesting.
Senator Robert Hill was the Environment Minister when John Howard became Prime Minister, and he was actually an important architect of the EPPC Act. And he went on a tour to the Central Highlands forests, and it's pretty amazing to have a minister's ear for 30 minutes, let alone sit in a car with him for 3 hours. And Robert Hill told me that the regional forest agreements were going to save the world. We were going to provide certainty to the industry, we were going to conserve endangered species, and we were going to make it profitable, secure jobs, all those kinds of things. The regional forest agreements have been an abject failure. And just last year, Robert Hill has signed on to the process of ending native forest logging. But it's really interesting, the science part of where Robert Hill was at, because he had several minders, including several very high-ranking minders these days, who told me in no uncertain terms when I first met Robert Hill about revegetation. They said, oh, we already know everything we need to know about revegetation. You scientists just need to get out of the effing way and we'll go with it. So that was the Natural Heritage Trust, about $3 billion worth of investment. I think we got about $500 million worth of outcomes. I think that with something like the nature repair market done well, with the right kinds of monitoring and the right kinds of places, we can do a lot better. And Robert Hill understands that.
Wildlife of the Central Highlands reports that Forest Fire Management Vic are clearing Myrtle Beach, Tarongo Plateau, Yarra Ranges National Park with no independent regulator. How can this be?
Well, again, this is a problem of poor regulation in the forest space. There is a body within the Victorian Government called the Office of the Conservation Regulator that has a lot of people that don't seem to be able to regulate this properly. But I think one of the important things in this space is that cool temperate rainforest is very wet, it's very dark, and it acts as a natural fire break to the progression of fire through the landscape. So it's actually counterproductive to put a fire break through a natural fire break. And when you do that, you open up the system and you actually make it more flammable, not less. This is contrary to what Phil Zylstra describes as ecological cooperation. And this is where we need to use the science and understanding of how forests work to deal with some of these kinds of problems. We should not be bulldozing so-called fire breaks through some of these areas. Now, there is actually also a financial imperative here. So putting in literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometres of fire breaks costs a lot of money. There is a role to step back from this and say, if we're going to spend $200 or $300 million, do you think that we might actually get a better return on investment from other approaches to tackling fire, including new technologies? And that's crucial. We are not asking some of these fundamental questions about maybe we can get a better return on investment for that $300 million than doing things that we thought was appropriate from the 1950s rather than the 2020s. I'm not going to make any friends with that, I know, but that's the reality. There are ways of detecting fires quickly and new technologies developing in this space to suppress them quickly. And I think we can do a lot better with recognition of some of the science in this space.
What do you think of hazard reduction burning as a way of mitigating bushfire risk?
So this is one of the most controversial areas. The science of hazard reduction burning is actually incredibly thin in terms of what's known about it. What we do understand is that hazard reduction burning is a kind of disturbance. When the forest is disturbed by logging or thinning or prescribed burning, you often have a pulse of regeneration that comes up. That's what trees do. They put seeds in the soil, all those kinds of things. That pulse of regeneration can be very flammable. That flammability can last for quite some time. And when we published a paper earlier this year on disturbance-stimulated flammability, it was very interesting that some of the fire chiefs said, "Oh, there's nothing here to see." I need to read you this from a very high-profile former fire chief. "Thanks, David. This is fascinating stuff, disturbance-stimulated flammability. Of course, you and Phil Zylstra, the co-author, will be attacked for daring to question the prevailing philosophy within fire services. I haven't read it through fully yet, but from a firefighter's perspective, your paper describes what I've been seeing for decades. The more you burn, the more you have to burn. It's the old conundrum. If you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got." This was a very, very senior fire chief that locked horns with Prime Minister Morrison regularly. The key thing to think about prescribed burning is that it's effective for a very short period of time until the vegetation comes back. It's effective when it's done close to houses and it's done frequently. It is not effective where you're bulldozing firebreaks through wet forests and elsewhere. We need to make sure that we focus our prescribed burning where it matters, and we need to dispense with burning vast areas of remote forest where it actually makes it more flammable. So there is a need to rethink this approach of these massive industrial scale prescribed burns. They're often done under the rubric of, this is just like cultural burning. Cultural burning was not like this. Cultural burning was not done at anything like the intensity or the severity. Cultural burning was not done at anything like that scale. There is a need to question what is happening. The other thing that's important, and Monique knows this only too well, that breathing in large amounts of smoke is not good for your health. In fact, more people die from smoke-related problems than are likely to die in a wildfire. So there is actually a need to think deeply about what we're doing here, including where we're building houses. But this is a big issue that needs to be addressed, because I do not think we are doing this very well at the moment.
We know that there's an increase in sudden death, cardiac events and strokes in relation to increased levels of ambient smoke and ppm pollution in the atmosphere. We don't capture that as adverse events or sudden deaths related to the effects of climate change, but they clearly are. Can I ask you, David, just before we go on to them, sorry ladies, how much does what we do with our forests here reflect or engage with what people do overseas? If we look at the US, Iberian Peninsula and the fires and things that they experience there.
There are aspects of learning from across the different continents. One of the things that we know, for example, is that the only place that loses more of its forest to fire than us is Portugal. And Portugal is dominated by plantation eucalypts. Eucalypt plantations are very flammable, just like all plantations. The reason that they're flammable is that they're very young. It's the same reason why young post-logging regenerated forests are also very flammable. But the advantage of plantations, if we manage them the right way, is that we can fragment them, we can break them up so that the passage of fire doesn't move across the landscape through vast areas. And there are other ways to think about how we manage plantations. For example, don't put plantations right close to where people live because they're so flammable. Plantations will stay in a flammable state through their entire their entire rotation. Plantations are often thinned after 14, 15 years, thinned again after 20 years, clear-felled at 25 to 30 years. They're flammable for the whole time. But also you get 3 crops in that 30 years as opposed to 1 crop over 80 years in a native forest. The best place that's made the best transition is actually New Zealand. New Zealand transitioned out of native forest logging in about 2002. And what it did was it unlocked investment in plantations, it unlocked investment in conservation, and it reduced the ongoing conflict. Almost all of the contractors that were involved in native forest logging in New Zealand made a rapid transition into other industries straight away. Much is actually also what's happened in Victoria. Most of the people that were in the industry have already transitioned elsewhere into other employment. But the other thing that's important to think about is that Victoria has seen a steep increase in the frequency of fire in the last 20 years. 1980 to 2000 as opposed to 2000 to 2020. The frequency of fire means that it is almost impossible to grow trees for long enough to become saw logs. A saw log takes about 80 years to grow. The chances of a tree growing for 80 years without being burnt is less than 20%. That is no basis for a sustainable industry that has any certainty for workers. The worst possible thing that we can do for workers is tell them that they're still going to have a future in 20 years' time. That uncertainty is terrible. It's terrible for people's mental health, their social status, their social standing. We should not be leading people on this sort of stuff. We can create better jobs, longer lasting jobs with a rapid transition.
Is there any risk of native forest logging resuming in Victoria?
On the morning of the 24th of May, when I was thinking about what had happened, the next day my publisher rang me and said, "We don't need to write this book anymore, it's all over." Seriously. And I said, "Have you seen what thinning looks like in Western Australia?" So native forest logging is ended in Western Australia, and you can take a jarrah forest with 100 trees and you can thin it down so it's got 10 or 12 trees per hectare. That's ecological thinning. But as a consequence of doing that ecological thinning, well, we've got all these trees left over, so we may as well, we better do something commercial with those residual trees that are left from thinning the forest. Okay? If you have logging machinery at a site, excavators, harvesting machines, log trucks, that's logging. So there is a lot of discussion at the moment about thinning forests. Thinning forests will increase fire risk. Thinning forests will destroy large amounts of biodiversity. Thinning forests will generate large amounts of carbon emissions. Thinning forests is logging. And so we're seeing this proposed widely. And as I said before, if we do not shift the tenure into a co-managed Great Forest National Park, fully protected areas, if we do not move across to World Heritage Protection status, because there's an exciting opportunity to do that, then I have no doubt that the industry is resetting and it will come back. And it will come back in a way where a lot of the legislation is watered down, so the ability for the legal fraternity to be able to prosecute court cases, I think, will be severely undermined. Just look at what has happened in Tasmania. That's why I'm not convinced that the industry is over until we have proper protection, until we have proper protection in a way that's co-managed to restore country, to care for country, to rejuvenate country, not log country. Thinning is logging. You need to be aware that thinning is logging, and logging is bad for country. Logging is bad for all the reasons that we've talked about. That's why this Engage Victoria process is so important, to tell people that we have to do this. We need to do it for economic reasons, for social reasons and employment, for climate reasons, for biodiversity reasons, and fire protection reasons.
But first of all, I'd really like to thank David and Monique for an amazing conversation and very informative, sometimes pretty tough. David does carry a big load in this space, and he's done an incredible job on this book, and I highly recommend you buy a copy if there's any left. We've got Eltham Bookshop down here selling them, and David's happy to sign them too if he hasn't already. But I'd just like to thank you both. I don't normally give alcohol as presents, but this one was actually irresistible. It is the Greater Glider New World Gin. And I'm told the essence is botanicals from their habitat, not from them themselves.